So basically, the first thing I want to do is "and another thing," just kind of work out how we're going to say "and another thing," like because I want it to sound like, like and another thing, that kind of when you're on the TV, when you're sort of on a rant or something. I want to say "and another thing," but I don't know how to do that.
Right. Well, you don't say "and another." You say another thing that gets me. It's like that, don't you?
Okay.
Really?
So, and another thing. Okay.
Right. And do what I say?
Yeah, go on, say it again.
And another thing that gets me is what we talking about first?
Oh, well, that's probably a good way of
starting.
starting.
Lack of organisation in audio spoken word recording sessions are sort of really me off. There, I won't have to say swear again now. But you'll expletive it overly because that adds to the humour, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, probably. I don't know. I might just cut it all out. Right. So, global warming.
Global warming, yes. Global warming.
I mean, do you think it's a real thing or is it made up?
Is it made up? Well, I don't know. I mean, the world may be warming up a bit, but it's just the problem I have is it's kind of become this kind of religion that you are, and if you happen to be a scientist who happens to question the validity of the evidence, then you're sort of written off as a sort of skeptic, somebody who's obviously in it to support big business and people making huge amounts of money, and to stop the good people, the good, kind, sweet, lovely people who believe in this absolute from saving the world like there's something out of I don't know, sort of some stupid superheroes, like heroes. They're like heroes. That's the way they see themselves, but they're not. They're just people with a bunch of theories, none of which really add up. And the whole thing is such a hodgepodge of different things chucked in together into the melting pot. So much is contradictory anyway. I mean, the main thing is, for instance, there was a scientific report brought out to dismiss kind of the skeptics, right? And it talked about something called unbalanced weather, or the climate becoming unbalanced. And I thought, well, what define balanced first of all? If you know what unbalanced is, you must know what balanced is. And they couldn't. I mean, there's no such thing as balanced climate. There's never balanced. If you had a chart which was covered a metre for 1,000 years, which seems a reasonable size for 1,000 years, a reasonable amount of detail, and you had it since time life began on Earth, you would stretch from here to Cairo. That's the size of it. And they're saying the only thing that matters is the last 20 centimetres. In fact, not even that. Last 2 centimetres of that 4,500 kilometre long chart. And that's the only thing we should be looking at. And everything else is just irrelevant. And it's like throughout that time, the weather goes up and down like a yo-yo. I mean, it's just like incredible. And the whole thing is just like a constant. They've decided we're leaving paradise, and paradise is this balanced climate that's been the way it's been for millions of years, and everybody's been happy and sweet and living in this kind of this neverland. And in fact, the climate just goes up and down all the time, randomly. That's the point of climate. It's completely random. It's affected by the big players, which is the sea, the earth, the atmosphere itself, volcanoes, seismic, sort of volcanic activity, and the sun, and that's it. And those are the only guys that have any sort of real say in it. It is not down to us. I mean, the last time there was a 10-degree rise, which some of these people claim is going to be a 10-degree rise in global temperature, mean global temperature, which will be catastrophic, admittedly. But last time it was how long do you think it was ago? Give me a guesstimate. I mean, when did the last time that happened?
I don't know. I reckon it must be, probably a couple of thousand years ago.
A couple of thousand years ago. No, wrong. 300 years ago. No, 300,000 years ago. No, 300.
Well, what caused that then?
Million years ago. Try 300 million years ago. That was the last time there was a 10-degree rise in world temperature. And you know what caused it? You have an idea what caused it? Right. What caused it was something called a basalt flood eruption. Okay, basalt flood eruption. Now, basalt flood eruption is something, it's basically a giant open lake of lava covering, in this case, something the size of Siberia. Literally, it was about 5,000 miles by 5,000 miles, 3,000 or 4,000 miles across. It was as a giant lake of lava. You would see it as a permanent glow in the sky, and it would have lasted, forget this, 80,000 years in order to produce enough CO2 to create a 10-degree rise in temperature. Now, you got to compare that to our little industrial revolution, and you can forget the first industrial revolution, which was all those cotton plant mills in Lancashire in the 1830s or something. Forget about that. It's too tiny, too utterly insignificant to have any effect. We're talking about the second industrial revolution and the transport revolution about 40, 50 years ago, which, we drive the arrival of the private car, in other words. And you're talking about second industrial, which ends at the end of the 1880s, 90s, after the American Civil War, which kick-started kind of mass production and things like that. And then you go through to about 100 years tops, right? 100 years of us farting out little bits of CO2, which on our scale looks big. On a global geological scale, it looks tiny, it looks minuscule. It just doesn't add up. And in fact, CO2 is the lowest level it's ever been in the atmosphere at this stage. So whatever we're putting into isn't making enough difference. It certainly isn't producing the kind of levels of CO2 required to create the kind of effect they're talking about. And, if you go back to 300 million years ago, and you compare what's happening now, it's just so utterly irrelevant, so passing and fleeting in its effect that it just couldn't possibly be having the effect they do. And then when you talk about CO2, which is the only gas they can identify that we're producing any amount, then CO2, it just doesn't do what it says on T. It's one of the weakest greenhouse gases. And the idea of the greenhouse gases being villains is another problem I have. The greenhouse gases keep the planet warm and habitable. Without them, it would freeze. It would turn into a giant snowball. It's done it once before. That was even longer ago than 300 million years ago. It turned into a giant snowball. It was only the arrival of volcanoes busting through the surface and spewing out vast amounts of CO2 that warmed the planet up and made it habitable for all life on Earth. So, it's just not true, and it can't do what they claim it can do. It just doesn't do it. And there's not enough of it around to do it anyway, no matter how many little bits and pieces we put in the atmosphere. And it all gets absorbed back into the life cycle. There's two carbon cycles. There's a long carbon cycle, which takes millions and millions of years, when it gets, little creatures absorb carbon in their shells, they die, float at the bottom of the sea, they then get subducted under the plates, the continental plates, and then they're blasted out through volcanoes about 100 million years later. That's the long carbon cycle. And the short carbon cycle is when it's a life cycle, basically. Eventually, all our carbon atoms will be released back into the environment, right? Okay, as we die, and all the living things that happens, and then they float, or we breathe out. We breathe out carbon dioxide. It goes up in the atmosphere. And it kind of floats around, but in 150 years, it's absorbed back into the life cycle. So that little molecule of carbon dioxide never stays in the atmosphere for longer than 150 years, and usually only a few minutes, because by the time you breathe out, walking past a bush or a plant or a tree, it will absorb most of what you breathe out in and just recycle that carbon molecule. So there you go. So it's not possible. It has no accumulative effect. So all the free stuff, the stuff in the atmosphere that's likely to cause this so-called, all those carbon molecules in that CO2 molecule, carbon atoms in the CO2 molecule, will be absorbed back into the environment, into living things, or into the oceans or whatever within 150, usually within a few days. So it's not no cumulative effect whatsoever. So you add all that up, there's enough holes there to suggest that perhaps it isn't a religion and it's just a bunch of people with a few ideas, and there is no sign of anything happening in the atmosphere at the moment that says there's any kind of global warming. It doesn't matter what they say about warming up. It's warming up as part of a natural cycle which has been going on for about 200 years now, and that's it. And people just made this stuff up. And it started with Mrs. Thatcher. Nobody talked about any of this until Mrs. Thatcher suggested the idea in order to close down the mining industry, which we're probably going to have to reopen now in order to make hydrogen for the hydrogen cars to get around the because coal's such a rich source of hydrogen, So we're going to, when we start, the hydrogen economy begins to develop, we're going to have to open all the coal mines to get the coal out again. Mrs. Thatcher closed them down for political reasons, so she could end the unions, and she made up this story, very, very loose of scientific theory about carbon dioxide. And I bought into everybody, oh, yeah, hey, we can't go around burning. And then you start to think about it and you think, oh, it's just a load of rubbish. The whole thing is just a load of half-baked theories. And when anybody suggests that perhaps they're not entirely truthful, then you are, you're no longer a scientist, you're a heretic, and you should be burnt at the stake using non-CO2 fuel, of course, low carbon emission fuel to burn your carbon-based body and return some more carbon to the atmosphere, So I just, that's the problem I have with global warming. There's a number of other things. You talk about the ice sheets. It was one the other day, last week. Those perfectly turned out news reporters who greet you in the morning when you're having your breakfast or 6 o'clock and sitting there, and they say, and now a report from the Arctic, and this huge ice sheet has broken off. And you think, well, it's April. Yeah, that's what they do in April. They break off, and then you hear nothing more about it. And of course, by the time you get around to October, it's refrozen back onto the shelf again. It's just the normal fluctuations of ice and all that sort of thing. But it's global warming. Yeah, but it's getting a bit warmer, so the ice is going to melt. But it's not going to cause any rises in sea temperatures because it's just water. Again, you look at anything they constantly claim about these things, and you realise after a while that it just really is completely contestable. Everything, I'm not sure whether there's global warming happening or not, whether it's man-made or not. I'm not a scientist, but everything they say is contestable. And what I'm worried about is a lack of free speech, the suppression of people who just simply disagree with this as heretics, as people who are clearly mad or driven by commercial interests to make up lies about the good people, the kind, sensible people who care about the planet and give a monkeys about anything, and they're the only people who matter. And the rest of us have to kowtow out them and not allowed to say what we think or feel or have their theories. A good scientist, first thing a good scientist does is try to disprove his own theories. Well, I don't see that with these people. They're trying to constantly prove their own theories and disprove everybody else's. But a good scientist spends time disproving. When he can't disprove his own theories, then he puts them forward and does a paper, essentially, and that's it, and that's what they should be happening here. These people should be going out their way to disprove global warming, not try and constantly turn it into a kind of semi-religious belief. Yeah, so that's my view on it. You got your money's worth there, Clive. It's good therapy, this, actually. I'm feeling calm for the first time in weeks.
I don't know if I get your puppies yapping. That's the problem there.
No, I've said my fill. I've had my say.
Would it be fair to say that you have passionate feelings about it?
Well, no, not passionate. It's just stupid people annoy me.